Welcome to Lesson 16 Workbook Exercises for Hebrew 1 and 2, Bright Old Testament 502-504 online edition. Today we have made our way into the Nifal stem, the Nifal binyan, as we occasionally call it technically in Hebrew, moving on from the Kal stem. In this Nifal, we'll be dealing with all the major parts of the Nifal, rather than taking them one by one as we did with the Kal stem. The concepts are the same, just the form has changed. So let's get started. I'm going to allow you to do section 1 of part 24 of your workbook on your own, since you're just adding in the markers of the Nifal form, and you can check those on your own before you send me your homework. I'm also only going to do certain examples here in section 2, since the various forms, perfect, imperfect, etc., repeat. We'll only do a few token examples, and you'll be able to figure out the rest on your own as you check your own homework. So let's start with number 1. How exactly would we parse this particular form of the Nifal? The key giveaway for the Nifal is the presence of that kametz under the second consonant. We have the preformative of the imperfect, and then we have the original consonant with the dagesh in it, representing the nun of the Nifal stem, but we always have that kametz under that next letter when it is a Nifal imperfect. This is a dead giveaway of the Nifal imperfect, and one you should memorize very carefully. When you see a especially I class vowel underneath that yod, or whatever the preformative is, a dagesh in that first consonant, and a kametz, especially a kametz, you know it is a Nifal imperfect. Let's move on to number 2. How would we parse number 2? Number 2 is just a straightforward Nifal perfect. We have the ten at the end of the verb, indicating that this is a second person feminine plural. We have the nun preformative, that is showing us that this is a Nifal. So we have a Nifal perfect. This one is especially easy because it's a nun plus the hirik, which again, Nifal is a nun plus a hirik at the beginning of that stem. So we have here a Nifal perfect 2FP from Shamar. Let's skip to number 4. How would we parse number 4? If we're paying attention, we'll see that there is a dagesh in the second consonant here in number 4, as well as the kametz underneath the zayin. This should automatically get our attention and cause us to think that we're dealing with a Nifal imperfect. However, we have a hey, and hey is not a preformative in the imperfect. Instead, this is an imperative. The preformative has actually dropped, as it will in the imperative, and instead of adding in a nun, which might convince us that perhaps we're dealing with a first-person common plural, imperfect, instead we add in the hey. The hey, which is again irregular because we're dealing with a nifal, we would expect a nun, but we have a hey in the nifal imperative. We need to memorize this irregularity, and yet remember that the kametz and the dagesh in that first consonant is still a giveaway that we're dealing with a nifal, not some other form. What about number 5? What should get our attention right away in number 5 is the hirik yod mem at the end of the verb. This almost always indicates that we're dealing with a masculine plural noun. In this case, though, we're dealing with a verbal noun, a participle. We have a nun on the front of this verb, and we have the kametz underneath the tav. We don't have a different vowel under the tav, which we might if we were dealing with a different form of the nifal. Instead, we have a kametz. You can glance back up at number 2 and see that there we don't have a kametz, we have different markings underneath the mem. This is a marker of the participle with the kametz under the tav. So we have the kametz under the second consonant if we're dealing with an imperfect or an imperative. Here we have it under the third consonant when we're dealing with a participle. And again, we have the marker at the end of the participle, the masculine plural marker, which helps us realize that we're dealing with something akin to a noun, in this case, a participle. What about number 8? Once again, number 8 is just a straightforward nifal perfect third masculine singular. I chose this one because of number 9. So how do we parse number 9, recognizing again that we have a comets underneath the tate here rather than the patak that we have in number 8? How do we parse number 9? Number 9 looks an awful lot like number 8, the difference being the comets under the tate. This gives away the fact that it is a nifal participle. Again, refer back to number 5 in the comets under the tav. Here we have the comets under the tate, but still under the second root letter of the root. So we have a nifal participle, masculine singular, since there is no ending, from katal. Okay, let's move on to number 10 on the next slide. Number 10 is a nifal imperative. Again, we have that comets under the kof, plus the dagesh in the kof. Again, we have the hey instead of a nun as our preformative here, because this is a nifal imperative to ms. But this is also the identical form of the nifal infinitive construct. That's a little tricky, but it reminds us that we have two forms here that are very similar, in fact identical, in the nifal. Only in the imperative to ms, though, is this the case. Okay, let's move on to number 12. How would we parse 12? The giveaway for number 12 should be the oat at the end. This tells us that we're dealing with a feminine plural noun, or in this case, a nounal verb, a participle. Again, this is a nifal participle. You see the comets underneath the kof there. So we have a nifal participle feminine plural from zakar. What about number 16? Number 16 is, once again, your boring nifal perfect, this time a 1cs with the T at the end. What about number 17? Number 17 has a holem vav in between the second and third consonants of our root, so we know that we're dealing with a nifal infinitive absolute. There's nothing else going on in this verb, so again, that confirms the fact that this is an absolute. What about number 18? Number 18 is also a nifal infinitive absolute. What may have thrown you is the presence of the hey at the beginning of this particular verb, but that's because, again, the nifal will occasionally throw in a hey instead of a nun, especially in the infinitive, absolute construct, and in the imperative. What about number 19? Again, note that there is a hey here at the beginning. The hey preformative here at the beginning of this nifal tells us that we are either dealing with an imperative or an infinitive. Again, the fact that we have the comets underneath the shin with a dagesh informs us that we're dealing with a nifal here rather than a different verb stem. The fact that we have the na at the end, which is usually a feminine plural verb ending, tells us that we are dealing with an imperative that has lost its preformative and added in the hey instead of a nun. What about number 20? Again, notice the hey, notice the comets, notice the dagesh. This is a nifal infinitive construct or a nifal imperative to fs. Again, we have the hey at the beginning, which tells us that we're either dealing with an infinitive or an imperative. We have the heroic yod at the end. So we're left either with an infinitive construct that has the 1cs on the end of it here, or we're left with a nifal imperative to fs. And in this particular case, either one of these is correct. So infinitive construct with a 1cs ending, or a nifal imperative to fs that has lost the tav off the front and supplied the hey. Okay, let's move on to our next section of exercises. You can do section 3 and whatever other sections there are in part 24 on your own, but let's move on to part 25, section 2. Again, we are dealing with the nifal in this particular instance, but this time we're dealing with weak stems. So how would we do number 1? How would that one be parsed? This is a nifal perfect 3ms. You have the nun on the beginning plus the heroic. However, this could also be a kal imperfect 1CP, remembering that the nun is the first common plural preformative in the imperfect stem, and we have nothing else going on in this verb, so it could be a cow. That's a tricky one we have to keep our eyes out for. What about number 5? How would we parse this one? I know number 5 is technically not one of the ones that you have to do, since you're only doing 1, 4, 7, etc. However, the fact that it can be two different things here, a nifal imperative 2ms and a nifal infinitive absolute, is part of what made me want to include it here. This is not an infinitive construct because infinitive constructs in third hey verbs always end in oat. This ends in hey, but it starts with a hey plus a hierarch plus the dagesh and the kaf plus a comments. So we know it's a nifal imperative or infinitive absolute. Again, you don't have to do number 6, just as you didn't have to do number 5, but I want to highlight number 6 just because it's so different. So how would we parse number 6? Number 6 is a nifal imperative 2MP, not 2ms as in number 5. And we add in the shuric from the second masculine plural preformative and suffix. We drop the preformative because it's an imperative, but that suffix causes the hey in the third hey verb to leave. So we're left just with 2 letters of the stem. A little tricky. What about number 16? Also a tricky one. How do we parse number 16? Number 16 is a nifal imperfect first common plural. We have the nun preformative, and typically we would put a dagesh in the ayin in order to indicate that this is a nifal, but we can't put a dagesh in an ayin because ayin doesn't take dagesh as a guttural. We still know that this is a nifal imperfect or imperative because we have the comments underneath the ayin, but here the fact that we have a nun instead of a hey tells us it's not an imperative. The fact that we have a nun tells us that this is actually the preformative, the 1CP, first common plural preformative. Again, a little tricky. The resistance to the dagesh in the ayin has caused the hierarch underneath the nun to lengthen to a seire, which may throw us off, but again, it's still an I-class vowel, so that should be our clue. What about number 19? How do we parse this one? Number 19 is actually pretty straightforward. We have the tav plus the hierarch plus the dagesh in the vav plus a comments underneath the vav plus the hierarch yod at the end. The tav, the hierarch yod at the end show us that this is a second person feminine singular. The fact that this is a shuric, which is not really a shuric, it's actually a vav with a dagesh and a comments. The vav is acting as a consonant, but the vav has shown up because this used to be a yod. And yod will historically go back to vav whenever there is a preformative. So here we have this irregular form where we have the vav acting as a consonant rather than a shuric. It's not shuric, it's vav with a dagesh. So this is a nifal imperfect 2fs. What about number 22? How do we parse this one? '22 is just a boring nifal perfect 1CP. We have the nu at the end, which indicates this is first common plural, and we have the nun at the front, that is part of the stem. We have the dagesh in the pei, that is actually representing the nun from the nifal. Let's move on to number 28. How do we parse this one? Again, you'll notice a hey, and you'll notice a vav with a dagesh in it. Once again, the hey narrows it down to either a nifal imperative or a nifal infinitive. However, because of the fact that we have na at the end of this verb, we know that this used to be tav preformative plus a na suffix, which is a second feminine plural combination. We've dropped the tav prefix and instead put in the hey for the imperative. Again, we have the comments under the vav, and the vav has a dagesh. This is not a shuric, this is a vav acting as a consonant because the root is yashav. That yod has gone back to the historical vav. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular lesson. Hopefully the nifal has made sense. The nifl, the hifil, these other stems, they may seem confusing at first, but I hope you'll see how simple they are once we get into it. That there are some key elements that show us how exactly we identify the given stem. Again, your exercises that we didn't cover, the ones where you identify the particular theme vowels and the consonants, and the ones where you write out the vowel, are meant to solidify the particular form in your mind and will aid you in the coming days as you learn to parse other stems as well.